Hello, once again on another episode of APORDE podcast. As you may know, APORDE stands for African Program in Rethinking Development Economics. I have a lovely guest today. His name is Dr. Seeraj Mohamed, correct?
That's right.
Nice to meet you, sir. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
My name is Seeraj Mohamed. I'm currently working in the South African Parliamentary Budget Office as a Deputy Director of Economics, and I'm an Adjunct Professor at the University of the Western Cape. And I've been working in development in South Africa in development economics since the early 1990s, for a long time.
All right. Here at APORDE, it's about rethinking development economics. What distinguishes heterodox or decolonial economics from mainstream approaches, particularly in terms of policy making?
At the very basic level, there are deep, almost philosophical and ideological differences between the heterodox and the mainstream, mostly what we call neoclassical economics. And if you look at the classical political economists like Adam Smith or Ricardo or Karl Marx, they developed economics at a time, Adam Smith particularly, where there was a shift from feudalism to capitalism, and he was pushing for more power to the industrialists and businesses, including small businesses, but sort of the new industrial class versus the landed class. And so a lot of the concern at the time was, how do you actually make sure that money is invested productively, what was produced, how it was produced, and how that was distributed, divided amongst, the different people in society, government, taxes, the capitalists and the owners of the means of production, and then the workers. And we see Ricardo's work and Karl Marx's work and the other classical economists working within that vein. What you had when you had the development of neoclassical economists, this emerged from what we call the marginalist economics group. There was an attempt to turn political economy into economics, which meant that you actually, before that, you didn't have the broader social sciences like sociology and anthropology and all that. It was all under sort of the guise of political economy or just the study, understanding society. And when they divided economics from the other things, just focusing on economics, they shifted away from looking at production, what was happening, and also household reproduction, what is happening in the household. Who produced, if you read Marx's work and Engels' work, they actually were talking about the fact that women are doing unpaid work in the household actually allows capitalism to develop, because they're producing the labor that then goes and work for the capitalists, and the capitalists are able to produce a surplus. So this idea of looking at where the sites of production or reproduction and then the distribution of income was shifted towards looking at just what's happening within markets and the transaction in markets, and the focus of economics and neoclassical economics became that of exchange. They thought that they wanted economics to become a science, just like the natural sciences. But the tools they were using, the math they were using, meant that they actually then had to reduce economics to the focus on that kind of exchange, but also then they had to reduce the agents, the economic agents, the people and the firms into very simple, what they would call rational beings. But for them, rationality was a very narrow form of rationality, which just meant people would want to maximize their utility. Everything they did was so they could consume more, they could enjoy more. And they would trade off, for instance, work versus leisure. And they wouldn't see work, for instance, as having a benefit to a person and being part of the, a calling, part of something they would want. And then the motive of a firm would just be to maximize their profits. So in this mathematization process that went with this, they started almost reducing us and our institutions into things that they could very simply turn into mathematical formalization. And that has been a trend that's happened within economics ever since. And they moved to, using more math and what we call more deductive means. And they actually shunned ideas that were using more inductive ways of thinking about things. So if you look at the heterodox they try to get away, or they actually critique the mainstream, the neoclassicals, for the kind of assumptions they make that makes their math work so that their theories can work. So, for instance, they would criticize this notion that an individual is a rational being because they maximize utility. They would talk about rationality within a context. You're rational acting within your role within society. They also said that, the mainstream, they're trying to impose a theoretical frame on their understanding of society, what we'd call an instrumentalist type philosophical approach. And the heterodox economists would say, well, we need to look at reality and let reality inform our theory. And so they would use a much more real-based approach. And then also with the shift towards the kind of math the mainstream neoclassical economists were using, they would have what they call methodological individualism, where they would see society made and the outcomes in society as a result of sort of the sum of the parts. So everything that we as individuals do then add up into a certain kind of outcome. But then it doesn't look at the reason why we create institutions, why we act together, or notions like Ubuntu, that the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts because of the way we interact, the way we work, the way we cooperate. And the institutions we set up to facilitate that and also to deal with conflict. Right? So within economics, there's always that kind of cooperation, conflict, tension. And so a lot of the development of neoclassical theory was based on those, and they have adjusted. They take more account of institutions now, but they've set up sort of their version of institutional economics. They've even set up their version of developmental economics, but they work within that broader philosophical understanding of the world, where they sort of often interpret the world through their models and through their theories, rather than sort of say, well, we're going to look at each country or each situation as something that can have its own reality and develop theory out of that. And they would critique people would then say, well, but you don't have a theory because you can't actually generalize across so many things because you're saying things are so different in different places. So there is that kind of tension, and many heterodox economists do use, more deductivist methodologies, models, and many of the models would be called structuralist because we look at the structure of the society and the economy, and we let that inform our theory and then the mathematical models we make when we try and sort of simulate the economy and what possible outcomes there could be. So there are these very, very deep differences, but also the fact that they end up focusing on this exchange. And because of the way they needed to do the mathematics to make their models work, is that lots of things get seen as externalities. Like when you produce something, it has an impact on the environment. It doesn't get fully costed into the thing you're producing. And so we call that an externality that trades within a market for below the true cost because the environmental pollution and other consequences of producing that thing aren't taken into account. But they also, if you think about household reproduction, the really important role that households play within economies. And within the feminist economics, this recognition that women usually do most of the unpaid labor within households and also communities and to keep. And they also then bear the brunt of if downturns, poor policy choices, cutting of social expenditure, they try and manage, within those kinds of situations. And within the neoclassical economic side, when they talk about macroeconomic policy and fiscal policy, they treat the household side as almost as akin to an externality, something that happens outside of their economics and the work they do. And so when government says, we want to do social spending or improve services delivery and those things, that gets counted even by our national treasury as just an expense, not an investment into the economy, not spending in the economy that then lead to positive outcomes that can help the whole economy. And so you get this kind of bias towards a conservatism that goes with that, against government spending, against welfare, against improving, service delivery and grants and things, especially in a country like South Africa where you have structural unemployment. And so there are lots of those kinds of things that sort of push the kind of neoclassical economics thinking towards a more conservativeness and a more market driven things because their focus is very much on the market. And also their basic models, like if you look at the basic geometry of supply and demand, it excludes the government. And so when the government gets involved, they say that's distortionary, and that's going to make the markets move off its equilibrium. Another thing is that their models generally assume that an economy will move back to an equilibrium. But if you look at unemployment in South Africa, for instance, there hasn't been a shift back to a situation where we have full employment as an equilibrium. We've had structural unemployment over a very long time.
All right. How long have you been working in Parliament?
Since 2016.
I want to ask, in your view, how would you assess the evolution of macroeconomic policy in South Africa since 1994?
Let me start off saying that, the views I'm presenting to you are my personal views, not the kind of views of Parliament or the government. But just talking about South Africa's macroeconomic policies, we, even before the end of apartheid, there was a shift towards more neoclassical, neoliberal ideology and thinking influencing macroeconomic policy within the apartheid government. And by the time of the transition, when they set up the Transitional Executive Council, people within the ANC economics were working with people like Derek Keys, who was the minister within the Nationalist Party government at the time, talking about policy choices and moving forward. And Derek Keys and the Ministry of Finance at that time had developed something called a normative economic model, which is a very mainstream model that sees the economy from this kind of neoclassical macroeconomics perspective. And their answers to the problems facing South Africa was sort of very much in line with, especially when it comes to budget issues or spending, it was that we needed to keep the deficit low. We needed to limit government spending until we managed to achieve a surplus, and then we could start spending on people, rather than saying, there's this major apartheid and colonial legacy that we have to deal with, and then shift from that. So the kind of macroeconomic thinking that became part of the growth, employment and redistribution strategy that was of the government of national unity that was adopted by government in 1996 was very much in line with that kind of mainstream neoliberal ideology and mainstream economic thinking as well. And we haven't diverted very much from that. And that was also sort of created this kind of austerity mindset within the way in which governments set budgets, but it also during the negotiations around the constitution, the Codesa, there was an agreement that the Reserve Bank would be independent, and that independence was enshrined within the constitution. And so that created a situation where, in the current thinking, basically the mainstream neoclassical consensus on macroeconomics was that fiscal policy should be avoided. It shouldn't be used to stimulate economies if you wanted to reduce unemployment, or if there was a recession or, some problems, global crisis like the COVID or the global financial crisis before that. But your main instrument should be monetary policy. And monetary policy was vested within the Reserve Bank as an independent organization, and their focus became very much one of keeping inflation low. Now, this is really important because within all developed countries after the Second World War, the main goal of macroeconomic policy was full employment. And it was important because if you look at what was happening in Europe after the war, they were rebuilding the destruction of the war. Many countries had to totally rebuild. And the USA, on the other hand, they weren't destroyed by the war, but there were these millions of young men who were basically been trained to kill people and had been involved in fighting, coming home, and they needed jobs. And one of the things they did during World War II was to bring women into the workforce, to take the role of the men who were abroad fighting. So they had to actually come up with this kind of approach to economics and macroeconomics that was saying that, the main goal should be for employment that, almost all developed countries at that time had become welfare states. They were using capital controls to control the movement of money out of their countries and into their countries to maintain a stability, but also to make sure that people couldn't avoid the taxes. If government pushed up taxes to help with the reconstruction or to say we need to build industries, rather than allowing people to speculate in financial markets around the world or to look for higher returns in other businesses elsewhere. So until the late 1970s, this was the model. And from the 1980s, you had this kind of where neoclassical economics had sort of pushed out these kind of what we often refer to as Keynesian ideas from economics, and they became focused very much on the monetary side and making monetary policy dominant and telling governments that fiscal policy is ineffective. And so we developed our macroeconomic policy very much in line with that kind of thinking. And the main tool that we have is being controlled by the Reserve Bank, who tells government we're independent of you. And the main goal of macro policy now is to keep inflation low. And so you can see what's happening in America. Trump is basically trying to fire people in the Federal Reserve and replacing the head of the US Federal Reserve System because he's saying, they're not bringing down interest rates fast enough. Now, I don't agree with Trump and his approach and his sort of almost fascist tendencies, but there is a very real concern about, that I agree with, that there should be more of a focus on unemployment, on economic growth, and a broader understanding of the economy than just saying that we need to maintain price stability and inflation. But South Africa's gone that route, and we see now with the discussions where they want to bring the target down to 3% without actually caring about the failures happening in any other parts of the economy, like having one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. It allows the central bank, and with that kind of independence, to play that kind of role that isn't necessarily one that I think will take the economy forward and help us address the very real problems we have.
I even saw a video clip online where Mbeki was saying between 1994 to 2008 there was growth, but then after that there's been just the opposite.
So this is also a problem because I told you that, after the Second World War, as part of all the developed countries, almost like going on a developmental path, wanting full employment, wanting to rebuild the industries after the war, they realized that they needed, one is on the social side, they needed to have more welfarist policies to help people as they were unemployed or if they weren't getting paid enough. On the other side, they realized that they needed to affect the allocation of capital towards productive activities, building factories, investing in jobs and those kind of things, rather than, looking for speculative activities in real estate markets or in finance. And so one of the measures government did, besides telling businesses, we'd prefer you to invest here or there, countries like Japan and South Korea, when they were starting after the Korean War, they did that. The governments got very directly involved in the allocation of capital. In Europe, you actually had some of the central banks directly lending to businesses. So not seeing their role as just keeping inflation low, but their role as being part of that recovery. But capital controls and the ability to control the movement of money into and out of your country is really important for that. South Africa has liberalized our capital controls. We've allowed more and more freedom of money moving in and out. And if you look at that period after 94, we had liberalized our capital controls and our exchange controls. So we allowed foreigners to bring in a lot of money. And, at the time, there was also liberalization in developing countries. So you had, during the 1990s, you had, I think, 12 financial crises linked to this, where foreigners with a lot of money who take short-term money, not invested in foreign direct investment in building investments in the country, but they would go in and look for financial opportunities, high returns they could make. So what we call portfolio flows. Short-term, it's often referred to as hot money. And then when they see a problem, they just pull that money out. And the local economy becomes dependent on that money. And when that money goes out, they can't repay their loans and they have a crash. And South Africa, before the global financial crisis, we were seeing a stock market bubble, we're seeing a house price bubble. And all of this, and this is the thing about GDP, people just being focused on GDP, is that they don't realize that not all increases in GDP is good for a country. One of the things I spoke about externalities, for instance, like say there's a big fire here and it destroys everything, and then we start rebuilding tomorrow. All that rebuilding money that we spent is an addition to GDP. So people say, oh, look, GDP is growing. So, but also then when there's lots of inflows of short-term capital, then it causes more financial activities. I spoke about the bubble in house prices. We saw house prices in South Africa between 2004 and 2006 double. And there were so many new developments where people would basically be told, if you have 200,000 Rand, you can buy into this development. And before the development's finished, there'd be so much demand that they could sell that share for 400,000 Rand. So people were speculating with, buying into and out of these. So we saw a high growth in the economy, but related to those kind of real estate and financial market speculative activities and being supported by lots of short-term money coming into the country. But you also then had, because this money was coming into the country, the banks were sitting with more money. And so you had them giving more money to those who had access to credit. Credit card debt going up, people getting second mortgages, people getting 110% bonds. And so the banks were then also on this kind of bandwagon of supporting that growth. So when Mbeki talks about the economy was doing well, he's looking at GDP and just GDP growth in a very, very facile way, in a sense. And I was arguing that at the time, if you look at the way in which our share indices had gone up, that had gone almost straight up at one point, like between 2003 and 2007. The house prices, as I said, 2004 to 6, they doubled. People were buying cars like crazy, HP loans. The average debt to disposable income in South Africa grew to over 80%. Now, if you look at South Africa, the people get the kind of money to buy houses and cars are probably about 20% of the population, right? If you look at what happened before the subprime crash in the US and countries like New Zealand that also had a crash, their debt to disposable incomes grew to about 120 or 130. Right? So South Africa's 80, I think, is the equivalent of a US 120 because we've got so few people who get access to that kind of credit from the banks. So there were so many people sitting with too much credit card debt, housing debt, car debt. And I was saying, we're going to have a crisis. We're going to have a crash. And then the global financial crisis hit. And then I was saying, if the global financial crisis hit, we'd have had a crash anyway. It didn't happen. We would have had a crash anyway. And that kind of growth is dangerous and unsustainable. And we shouldn't actually just see any GDP growth as positive. The kind of GDP growth we should see as positive is the kind of GDP growth coming out of productive activities, job-creating activities, and, where people actually are able to have jobs where they can develop themselves and, move up the ladder. With the Asian tigers, they called it the wild geese strategy. So as Japan became more developed, our geese fly almost like in a V shape. The front one who's the strongest takes the headwinds and the others benefit and they can get into that and avoid the resistance of the headwinds and they can take off. And so Japan moves into higher and higher tech and more sophisticated. And the countries, what became the Asian tiger countries, South Korea and others, they started picking up the kind of things that the Japanese weren't doing. And they started then becoming, in their own rights, global original manufacturers, creating jobs, developing their own technologies, developing their own lead firms within global value chains. So, we need to think about how South Africa becomes that kind of a country and we grow towards that. And so for me, the major kind of things that we look at, and I mean, the UN has said this, the Human Development Index developed by the United Nations Development Program was a way of saying, that GDP is not a good measure. In South Africa, if you look at GDP per capita, it doesn't tell us how rich we are because we've got the highest inequality in the world, right? So that income the top 10% are getting 2/3 of the income of the country. So GDP and growth in GDP doesn't actually tell you that everybody's getting better off in South Africa. So I've gone a long way to answer your question.
No, thank you. We've actually run out of time. But that was very insightful, the GDP aspect as well. Thank you for that. Let's say goodbye to our listeners. All right. Thank you, Seeraj.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.